going to come back to, to bite. And we even talked about how honorable Abner was in that interaction. Remember where he was telling Azael, he said, listen, I don't want to kill you. Stop pursuing me. This isn't going to turn out well for you. So not only does Joab kill him, he kills him in a very dishonorable way. He betrays him, he deceives him. And this says more about Joab than it does about Abner, the type of man that Joab is, that he would do this to a man like Abner. And so what we talked about is very ironic, is that you have Abner, who's the right-hand man of this wicked king, but who's very honorable. And then you have Joab, best for the kingdom. But really, it's about what is best for Joab. And there's people that do that within the church, don't they? Right? They act like, well, this is really what is best for the church, and really, it's what's best for them. You have that happen within politics. You have it happen within your own relationships. And you have to be very leery of these type of people. And you have to be willing to call out their deception and their duplicity. Otherwise, other people are going to suffer. And the problem is that David condemns Joab. But he doesn't punish him. He doesn't even discipline him, really. He just places a curse upon him. That is not the best way to start off your new kingdom. Now, if you're reading this right now, before we read the rest of the chapter, and if you didn't know anything else, you would be thinking, well, so much for the covenant, right? So much for uniting the kingdom, so much for solidifying the kingdom. Abner was the main one who was moving this forward. Now all of a sudden, it looks like David had Abner killed when he came to visit him. This is not going to work out well. But what we're going to see is that what wins the heart of the people, to David, is what has won the heart of people to David from the very beginning. And that is who David is. It is his heart and his person. And you're going to see in this moment, once again, the biggest contrast between David and Saul was that David is genuinely concerned about Israel. Israel is his great priority, the nation itself. In contrast to Joab, who obviously doesn't give a single thought as to the ramifications of what this will do for the kingdom. That's the irony, is that he is accusing Abner of trying to cause issues in the kingdom, but Joab himself, by his actions, could have ripped the kingdom in half because of what he does here. And so, and by the way, if you know the story, this is going to come back to bite Joab later. And what's interesting is even though, and I'll give a little bit of leniency for David here, a little. Even though he doesn't punish Joab now, he is going to ensure that Joab is punished later. He just isn't the one that does it. So, you can give David a pass if you want to for that. But here, now we're going to see how David responds. Does anybody have questions or comments about that? Or anything that we've discussed? Yeah. Yeah, it could be certainly be some political moves here, right? The least the less of two evils. Because if I punish Joab, then that might cause more issues than good. Damon? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, we've previously talked about that in the past, how other people are far more willing to take vengeance into their own hands, whereas David trusts in the vengeance of God. But there's also an aspect of part of his responsibility now as the king is to make sure that justice is upheld within the nation. And that has to be balanced out with his, because I think David viewed, for example, his relationship with Saul as that would be pursuing his own vengeance, that would be pursuing his own self-exaltation. Whereas there are times where David really honestly seems to show a little bit of nepotism at times. And, maybe I'm being too cynical of David in that, but it seems like he struggles with that. I mean, as all parents do, I think, at times, right? And so, but it ends up causing him some issues. And I think that, and I'm really not being critical. I hope I'm not being too critical of David, because I think I tend to be like David in this, in that I tend to err on the side of mercy sometimes, and it comes to bite me. It comes back to bite me, and some of us do that, where we want to give people the benefit of the doubt, and we do get the benefit of the doubt, and hopefully the vast majority of the time we do that. I think that that's overall the type of spirit that we should have towards people. But at other times we need to have a little bit more discernment, I think. And I think that that's what David was lacking at times. He didn't have the discernment that he needed at times to handle some of these issues. But of course, I don't either. So I really am not being too hard on him, because I understand that. But it does come back to bite him later. It causes serious issues within his kingship. Anybody else? Okay. All right, so now we see David mourning in verses 31 through 39. Then David said to Joab and all the people who were with him, "Tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and mourn before Abner." And King David followed the bier. And they buried Abner at Hebron. And the king lifted up his voice, and he wept at the grave of Abner. And all the people wept. And the king lamented for Abner, saying, "Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen." And all the people wept again over him. And then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was yet day. But David swore, saying, "God do so to me, and more also, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down." And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as everything that the king did pleased all the people. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's will to put to death Abner, the son of Ner. And the king said to his servants, "Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I was gentle today, though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are more severe than I, and the Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness." Now, David is mourning, and he demands a national mourning over Abner. He commands this kind of national day of mourning for Abner. And he writes a little poem about him. And what he is decrying is how Abner was killed. He wasn't conquered in battle. He was betrayed. He died the death of a fool, if you will. Someone in the darkness stabbed in the stomach. And so this was very, a dishonorable death from David's perspective. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yep. Right. And I think that's what David is saying here when he talks about your feet not being fettered. Like, you aren't conquered in battle and then kind of, you were conquered and then slayed because of some battle. But rather, you were an honorable man and you died in the dark, stabbed in the stomach, under the auspices of goodwill. Yeah, I don't think Abner had any assumptions that Joab was going to do that. I think he might have thought, well, hey, there was something else David wanted. me to do before I go back? And so he comes back, and obviously he was in a very vulnerable state because he was able to be stabbed in that way. You know, he wasn't armored up. He wasn't, it was just him coming to talk. And so, yeah, he was in a very vulnerable. So it's not just the fact that he died, but how he died from David's perspective. And David is such an honorable man that he's weeping over this man who for the past 7 years has really been his enemy. He has been keeping back what is owed him. David is owed the other tribes. And we already saw how the elders are more than willing to make David their king. The only factor that is holding that back is Abner. And so this man who has been withholding David his due, this is who David is weeping over. And here we see, once again, he's wept over Saul. Now he's weeping over Abner. And it's because I think, again, David understood. Notice he said, "Don't you know that a prince and a great man has died today in Israel?" David's chief concern isn't the solidification of his own power. It's the glorification of Israel, and therefore the glorification of God's name. And so for something like this to happen in Israel, greatly dishonors the name of God, because a man who was very honorable died in this way. But because of David's response, he wins over the hearts of the people, right? The people notice. They come to him and say, "Hey, you need to eat some bread." And he says, "I'm not eating bread today. Today's the day of mourning. I'm not eating bread today." The people notice that. And it says it pleased the people. And the writer kind of says, as everything that David did pleased the people. That seems very kind of exaggerated for us, right? But the writer wants us to know that David's kingship overall was, and this was, the case even in Jesus' day, was viewed as kind of this golden age of the Israelite nation. Now, Solomon is going to make Israel richer than it's ever been. He's going to expand the borders even farther than David will. But David is viewed as kind of the consummate king of God, the king of Israel. And so, it kind of seems almost like rose-tinted glasses, but from the perspective of the Israelites, this certainly was true. That David did what pleased the people. But notice, again, there's a contrast here. Because Saul tried to please the people, right? But he tried to please the people by doing what? Doing what the people wanted, right? Or so he said. Right? This is what the people wanted to sacrifice. The people wanted this, so I went ahead and did it. David doesn't try and win over the hearts of the people by giving in to the people. In fact, he at times does the complete opposite of what the people want him to do. But because he is a person of radical honor, of this radical integrity to the devotion of Israel, it wins the hearts of the people. Now, that is why later on, when he commits his sin with Bathsheba, that it is such a glaring mark on David's kingship. Because everything else, you're looking at David and saying, this is a good man. But even the best of men are sinners. And even the best of men can do terrible things. And that's really, sadly, becomes the story of David. And is a humbling reminder to all of us that even though no matter how close to the Lord we might draw, we must always be mindful of our own weaknesses and our own sinfulness before God. There's a little note that David says at the end of verse 39, in which he says, "The sons of Zeruiah are more severe than I am." And I think that's very true. As we mentioned, I think David is overall a very merciful king. But do you remember before, whenever the first time that David had the chance to kill Saul, it said that he had to, and we said that the Hebrew there said he had to get violent with them, right? Because they wanted to kill Saul, and it said that David had to get violent with them to convince them to settle down. This, I think, is why. Because the type of men that David was over were not characterized by his virtue. They were men like Joab, who were practical, pragmatic, and took out their enemies when they had a chance. And when you're over those type of men, it takes a lot of strength on your part to be able to restrain them. David was able to restrain them when he knew what their intentions were. But now he's having, Joab goes out on his own and goes renegade and possibly causes issues for the kingdom if it wasn't for David's own character. I'm not convinced that the kingship would have been solidified. And here's what's interesting. I'm not convinced that the kingship would have been solidified if David would have eaten bread that day. That one little moment, all it is bread. We're going to be talking about bread this morning in the sermon, but all it is bread. And the fact that he refuses to eat bread is what wins over the hearts of the people. What if he would have eaten that bread? That one little insignificant moment could have changed the direction of the entire kingdom. And it's a reminder to us sometimes that sometimes even the moments that we view as insignificant, as little, as unimportant, can in fact have serious ramifications for our life. And David here makes the right decision because he acts out of his own integrity and acts genuinely. I don't think this is David putting it on. I think this is a genuine sorrow that he has for Abner. Any questions or comments about that? Yes. Yeah, and these are like the politics of the day, and of course our politics are quite different in some ways and very similar in others. You still have a lot of backstabbing going on, certainly in a lot of politics. But you also in the past, and sadly it's not so much the case currently in our nation, in the past you would have individuals who disagreed severely on both sides of the, very different sides of the political spectrum, but still respected each other, right? But still honored each other for who they were. And sadly, that is becoming increasingly less and less. And as we will see within Israel, whenever that happens, there's serious ramifications for that. Whenever you dehumanize the person on the other side of the political spectrum, when you don't respect them as an image bearer, then that's when serious problems occur. And so this is what happens with Joab. He becomes this figure who is only concerned with power, with vengeance, and because of that, he's going to suffer the consequences later in life. So, all right. Thanks for everyone being here this morning.